like to call to order the September 30th, 2008 meeting of the Glendale Redevelopment Agency. May we have the roll call, please?
Agency members: Draymond.
Here.
Montero.
Here.
Weaver.
Here.
Yusefian.
Here.
Chairman Najarian.
Here. May we have your report?
Agenda for the September 30th, 2008 regular meeting of the Glendale Redevelopment Agency was posted on Thursday, September 25th, 2008 on the bulletin board outside City Hall.
Thank you. Next item, please.
So approval of minutes.
So moved.
Second.
And if there are no objections or corrections, the minutes will be approved as submitted. Next item, please.
Next item is oral communications. Discussion is limited to items not a part of this agenda. Each speaker is allowed 5 minutes. Members of the redevelopment agency may question or respond to the speaker, but there will be no debate or decision. The matter may be referred to staff through the executive director for investigation and report. At this time, Mr. Chair, I'd like to point out that there is one oral communication card. It was submitted for item 2A, but since that was a closed session item, perhaps the speaker would like to speak on it at this moment.
Perhaps he might. Typically, however, we take requests to speak on closed session before we enter closed session. So in light of the fact that we've already concluded closed session, Mr. Milano, do you still request to speak? You may speak on that item for 3 minutes. Well, unless you want to make it an oral communications, which would make it a 5-minute.
No, this is sufficient.
Okay.
Good afternoon. My name is Herbert Milano, members of the agency. Oftentimes, when the public gets to read just the excerpt that appears on the agenda item or items that were in the closed session, the only thing we can do is extrapolate from that item information that appears to have some connection. So whatever I say here now is only conjecture, simply from the information that I see here. But this is information concerning two properties, at least the one that I want to refer to, and properties that are very close to or on the corner of Brandon Wilson and Brandon, Maryland. And from my recollection, the property in question might be City Center 2, a property that I challenged with regard to the environmental impact report. And this particular property, if I recall correctly, was fairly much an arm's length transaction between the developer, Amity, and basically in the city as far as developing a hotel residence and another high-rise residence next to it. In and of itself, I could not imagine how there would be any type of city participation or ownership, as it states over here, although it appears that there is now a link between 111 East Wilson, which, if I recollect correctly, is the city parking space on the corner of Maryland and Wilson. And if it is, I wonder how that relationship to link these two things together come up. But from what I know of previous cities' involvement in using redevelopment money to encourage additional development, it appears that these two fairly independent parcels are being linked together for purposes of providing a city participation. And it's only conjecture on my part, because I am only coming from this reading. And I began to question, how a city participation can be justified in light of the current economic conditions that we have. I also put a request to speak on item 6B1, which has to do with the a proposal to get, advisory services for a bond. So in my mind, I'm putting these things together and wondered, if our approach is for transparency, I wonder if any of this can be decoupled in such a way that the public is being given a more transparent approach to what the city is doing with its properties, since, of course, it's being done in closed session. The public doesn't really get to participate until after the fact. And it is my concern that maybe these things are being coupled and they shouldn't be coupled. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Milano. Mr. Yusefian?
Scott, is 6B connected to 2A? No. Thank you. I think you got your answer on that one.
Okay, thank you. There being no other cards for oral communications, I will close that agenda item, and let's move on to the next item.
6A is Director of Development Services regarding Embassy Suites Hotel helipad screen materials, and this is a report only.
Thank you. Mr. Lanzafame.
Mr. Chairman, members of the agency, in 2003, the agency approved the final design for the Embassy Suites, which included a screen element around the helipad. There was some question as to how that would be developed, what it would be during a meeting, I believe it was last month. Staff is here today to present how the developer is treating that screen element that was approved in the design. With that, I'd introduce Alan Castillo, project manager for this. And while he's walking, I'll note there are two representatives from Kamsang that are here that if you have questions of the developer.
All right.
Artie?
Good afternoon, Agency Chair Najarian and members of the agency. The Embassy Suites Hotel is currently under construction and is anticipated to be completed in October of this year. At the August 19th meeting, the agency requested additional information regarding the helipad. The agency requested that the developer actually provide details on finished materials since none had been previously provided. Staff has worked with the developer to implement the approved screen as shown on their submittal. And per the design intent previously presented, the developer will be installing a 2-inch galvanized metal tubing attached 4-inch apart on a 1.5-foot metal frame that spans the large helipad support columns. With that, I have the developer here, John, who will present the details of the design of the helipad.
Good afternoon, members of council, Mayor. My name is John Hicks with Kamsang Company, and I represent the developer for the Embassy Suites project at 800 North Central Avenue. And as Mr. Castillo has alluded to, what we have done is, based on the discussions that have occurred in the past, there was some concern that the structure as presented some challenges, and that the current condition with the exposed structure would need to be screened. As a consequence, we went ahead and took steps towards mediating the current challenge that currently is possessed by adding the 2-inch horizontal tubing over a structural frame that is intended to mask all of its structure. And as a consequence, what you're looking at today is our mock-up of that attempt. We have provided some screening material that is intended to be temporary. Glendale Fire Department has actually requested that the mesh that has been placed behind the tubes be removed due to a life safety issue with that mesh, and that you can't get a fire-treated or fireproof or fire-resistant material in the densities that we're dealing with. And what we've actually discussed is looking at leaving the horizontal tubes in place and still providing the screening for the structure, but minus the mesh. And with that, what we're hoping is that we can get that approved, and that the original intent has been fulfilled in screening the structure.
Several questions. I anticipate Mr. Quintero.
Yeah, well, this doesn't do much. How about the rest of the underside there? You're not planning on installing any mesh on, say, a horizontal level?
No, sir. The original challenge that was presented to us was that the exposed structure for the helistop itself was the initial challenge that was brought up to us.
Tell me again why this structure was not placed somewhere else on the rooftop. Was that the original design? It was to be placed in another location? That's how I remember it.
That is correct.
Right. So tell me again why you didn't place it where it was.
It was two things occurred during the design process from DRB. One, there was real nebulous as to what this structure was. There was a helistop that was addressed. And I say that in that we never really addressed materials at that time during DRB and agency. But we wanted to address that there was this mass that was going to sit up on top of the building. The original intent was that structural engineers were looking at providing a concrete deck. Once the structural loading of the building occurred, the only design solution that occurred, which is a hybrid system of a moment frame with a post-tension slab, the structural elements or the structural columns that were required to support the pad were getting to be so great that they physically couldn't be supported by the roof. In other words, the amount of concrete that would be required to cantilever a deck 14 to 20 feet, the structure became prohibited by the sheer building. I mean, it just couldn't support the weight.
So this specific structure
Correct.
appears fairly lightweight.
Correct.
But this specific structure could not be placed in another location on the roof? Is that what you're saying?
No, sir. And part of the reasons and the challenge that exists is that we have an atrium. This atrium consumes roughly 1/4 of the building site. If you were to walk into our atrium, you can see it's pretty sizable, and it's some 60 by 80 feet in square or a rectangle. That's a lot of roof real estate. We could not, with the location of the skylight, it's a gable-style roof. This helistop was actually a few feet above that ridge line, based on when you bring the FAA into play, their rules and regulations for landing helicopters, the rotor wash that's required, the clearances that they're looking for to not have any structures impede in their path of travel or their flight path. Basically, compounded by the loading of the decks and the structural criteria, by taking such a large hole out of the building, they went to a design-build option, that being the company FEC, who specializes in helistops and heliports all over the nation. A plan was submitted to Redevelopment Agency, the staff member that was involved at the time, and the plan was stamped off that this is actually what would be constructed up on top of the roof.
Yeah.
And then, of course...
Do you have the original design? Does the staff have the original design that was...
I don't have it.
Well, I'd like to see it. If we don't have it this afternoon, then I'd like to see it, because, when I think of what we approved, yeah, I'd like to see that. When I think of the original design,
Here's the rendering right here.
it's been,
It's just very...
the big difference between what we approved originally and what I now see when I
Yeah, it's pretty conceptual.
drive by it. Well, let me just say that I'm not at all satisfied that this is sufficient. It seems to me of the horizontal, this same grid system or tubes that you've done on a vertical plane, it seems you could, at the bare minimum, do it on a horizontal plane. Otherwise, you're looking at the same material landing pad itself. So, I mean, this just, it's really a pity. This is a very nice building. I drove by it yesterday afternoon. The atrium looks great. The drive-in facilities look great. It addresses Central quite nice at the lower levels, and then you've just got this thing sticking out in the corner that just, it's ridiculous, quite frankly. I don't understand it.
I had Mr. Drain.
That's all right.
Mr. Weaver?
So what we see in the concept was the original, the structural, what you were talking about, not this.
The original going back that many years, the original concept was that we knew that the helistop had to be positioned in such a fashion, and it would be in this northwest corner of the building.
But the design,
Was unachievable.
that's the problem I'm finding when we see things at the design review stage and we approve it. Then it's got to go through the permitting process, and now you're dealing with structural issues, you're dealing with fire and other life-saving issues, whatever. And when we end up seeing the final product, it's not going to look like what we approved because of code requirements. Even the building doesn't look like what we approved here. It's changed. I can look at it. It's not the same building. It's been changed. So, I don't know. To me, that looks ugly, but You have to have that fence netting, I guess, out there for safety reasons too, right?
Yes, sir.
That doesn't show on what we approved. I understand the space up there, but it's a shame it's going to look like that forevermore. Maybe if I painted it white or something, it'd disappear a little, but it's black. When you're looking into the sky, you see it. I think you see everything.
You know, we've had an opportunity to actually, work on this, and, I think with the suggestion of actually covering the structure has gone a long ways. And when you're standing up, I mean, the angle that we took this at, I mean, quite frankly, we're standing underneath the building. Okay, so we give give you an idea on that. We were looking at what was addressed, and that was, everybody was discussed, it seemed the discussion came from not so much as the helistop itself, and as an element. And I understand, even from a design standpoint, the intentions and the visions that originally occur, are different in one's mind. But what was addressed to us was that the vertical elements, the fact that you could see the vertical elements, and that caused plus compounded by the reflection of the white roofing material that's required, was the original challenge that was brought up to us.
I was going to say, I guess we did not communicate well with you. Say.
Mr. Quintero.
Well, let me say this, that when you get off the freeway at the 134, and you're there at the light, and you look to the left, you don't see literally, you see very little of the building, but what you do see is this horrible, I don't even know what to call it, this horrible structure just kind of sticking out, looming over Central. So the very first sight from someone who's headed east, gets off at Central and looks left, looking for the Embassy Suites, that's what they're going to see, this landing pad. So I think you have, Mr. Weaver may have a good idea, maybe painting it a beige, try to spray paint it a beige, or some way to sort of cover it up. And the vertical isn't enough. You've got to do some horizontal work. You've got to try to cover up the what looks to be like a 5 or 6 foot gap between the end of the actual pad itself. I can see the netting around. That's going to be difficult to deal with, but certainly the underside you can do something with that.
Mr. Draymond.
I don't even know what to say, other than I didn't have benefit of having input on this until, for the first time, the last time you were here. I can only, and I'm not going to second guess my colleagues as to what they went through with this process as it went along. I can only tell you this, I continue to get email after email and phone call after phone call about how ugly this building, not the building, this piece on the top, the helipad, is. When I drive on Central in the city, what I see is a large, attractive building, and then I look up and see what looks to me like a series of washboards with chain link fence sticking out from it. And I got to tell you, it is singularly unattractive, and I think we have to do better. And, to say, well, this was unachievable, so you have this. To me, this is a no-go. And it isn't just the gap between the top of the washboard and the rim of the helipad. It's this structure sticking out over the edge that's the netting. Yes, the netting has to be there, but I'm not convinced it has to look like that. And one of the things that bothers, I think, that draws so much attention to it, frankly, is the netting, is the structure that's holding the netting. Why, for example, can't the tubing that is up there be, I don't mean the tubing on this, the tubing around the netting, it's holding up the netting structure. Why can't that be uniform as you look at it in some way so that your eye doesn't go, it just looks like an unfinished structure. That's what it looks like, and it is just singularly unattractive. And for a brand new building that's supposed to be the showcase of North Central, and it's a very stylized, modern-looking design with this thing on the top, I can't convey to you how it pains me. and how it pains our residents. Anyway, I'll reserve the rest of my comments for later, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Issa.
This is a design build. A design build is you can design to meet some of the specifications as far as your structure is concerned. It's one of the, I'll be very frank to you, it's one of the ugliest helipads I have seen. And I've seen a lot of helipads. Whoever this design build who designed it needs to go back to design school. I do not accept this acceptable. What was in here was a very simple design. It doesn't have to be made out of concrete. It could be made out of something else. I understand you had to reduce the weight. I understand it has to be a different material to take the weight out. But I think the treatments could be done differently. And also, Mr. Draymond's right. The netting is objectionable too. I mean, you look at that, there is no consistency as where they are. I mean, it just looks terrible. It's like design this beautiful cake, and on top of it, you just put the ugliest thing that you could find for a wedding. It just looks terrible to me. I will not accept this. To be honest with you, there is no such thing. In construction business, there's no such thing as impossible. There's always possible. It just costs more money. And that's the problem. And my issue is, who signed off on this modification? Which staff person signed off?
What? The project manager is no longer working with the city.
Who was it?
Bob Cadillac.
That explains it.
Who approved that?
Bob Cadillac.
He had approved the design build portion in consultation with the developer and the building department.
Well,
We didn't get a say in it.
Before we condemn him, though, he's been quoted in the newspaper as being opposed to it and talked about all the changes that were taking place. So how does that square if he's the one
Only
who
read
made...
what's in the newspaper. Perhaps I can ask, Camille, do you have a better right here, history of this? As we went through, this part was held out as a design build, and that part came later.
Mr. Chair, I'm sorry, and Emil, I beg your pardon, and I'm sorry. I apologize, and Phil, I apologize. But before we go down one of our rabbit holes about how this, because we spent an inordinate amount of time last time talking about how we got to this point. It really doesn't lead us anywhere in terms of what we're going to do going forward.
Right.
And, before we spend a half hour, 45 minutes debating, how we got here again, all we know, we're here.
This is what we got.
So, what are we going to accept? What are we not going to accept? I mean, I would just propose, Mr. Chair, that we try to focus on that rather than all the rungs of the ladder that brought us here. There's plenty of time when we'll all get eviscerated by the public for the design. We can talk about the steps as to how we got here. But what are we going to do with this? That's my bigger question.
And let me ask, what is this before us exactly? For approval? Do we have the power to disapprove at this point? Or is this just reporting to us as to how?
We were bringing you back information on how they were addressing the screening issue. I've heard a couple of you say that it's not acceptable. There wasn't a motion, there wasn't an action. We will continue to work with the developer for an alternative solution. We'd like to hear your ideas if you have them, that we can then talk about further activities.
I agree with Mr. Draymond. I mean, this is what we have. We can't wipe this out. We can't redesign it.
No. Sorry, I'm just saying that's not what I'm saying.
You can't
I'm
wipe
saying I just don't want to take
rabbit hole.
Emil's time and Phil's time explaining to us how we got here. But I join at least two of my colleagues saying this is absolutely unacceptable as far as I'm concerned. I could never approve that. it's just, you know, and I'm trying to choose my words carefully, as I think we all are, because we're not trying to be insulting. That's not the, but I have to tell you, this is singularly unattractive.
Right. And what I'm saying is, I mean, we're talking about two things here. There's the existing structure, and there's the attempt to screen it. I'm not sure we have the authority to say remove the existing structure, remove the helipad and do a new helipad. I think the direction we're going is the means in which it's being screened. And I would say that the designers, including our own design staff, think about this a little bit more and find a better means of screening. And Mr. Quintero's point is, you know, were the perimeter of that landing pad, not the underside of the perimeter, screened with that tubing, it certainly would be more palatable than what we have now. The safety netting around the perimeter, I'd like to hear if there's any alternatives available at all. I mean, I'm sure there's tons of federal regulations regarding the weight and the square footage and the support.
Well, we have some, I mean, you know, on any given day you can walk up on our roof and there's at least a 15-mile-an-hour breeze that's gusting across the roof. You know, when I spoke to the structural engineers and that we were discussing this, you know, people get real nervous when you want to start adding, essentially, large structures with great surface area that provide wind loads and start pushing up on these things and pushing down. There's a lot of forces that are generated around these types of structures. And unfortunately, this thing it sits up on the top of the building, and it is subject to wind on a daily basis. And, you know, you start talking about that steel structure not being designed to carry anything more than what it's carrying. And what does that do to the bolts, to the structures themselves?
Mr. Weaver.
Well, one thought, you don't have to do all four sides to begin with, because you're talking about the sides where it's visible from down below. If you used a mesh screen or mesh fabric, beige in color, that was porous enough to wind through it and ran it from the outer holes on the screen and angle it down in and attach to the building on those two sides. Only thing I don't know is how much pressure it's putting onto it, depending on what is the spacing. But it's the only way you're going to hide it is by coming down with a fabric and attaching.
And then I get in trouble with the fire department.
Why? On the outside edge? If you have two sides open, four sides?
They are looking for a non-combustible. We're a Type 1 fire-resistant construction. And so anything that is attached to or a part of this type of structure needs to be a non-combustible material.
And they don't make netting sort that does it?
I won't say no, it's just...
Is that a city regulation, or is that a state or federal regulation?
That was a request by the city
It was a
fire inspector.
request.
Well, it wasn't a request, it was that any type of mesh that does not, that you can't provide substantial information to comfort us in the fact that this is a non-combustible material will not go on this structure.
Maybe we ought to ask the fire department to investigate it a little more fully.
I think we need some more information. We've put some questions out, we've thrown out some designs and some materials, and I'm not sure that you have the answers unless you have read our minds earlier.
I know what you're being told.
So I'm thinking that we should put this for a return item, Mr.
Well, then
Quintero.
perhaps we can make it a metal mesh, but that's exactly what I thought we were going to be discussing. I thought there'd be some sort of angle to cover something that sort of integrates this pad into the rest of the building. And by the way, in terms of wind, there's helipads all over the city. So, and I actually probably live about 1,500 or at least 1,000 feet above. I live up there in the hills, and there's not normally 50-mile-an-hour winds on a regular basis. Let me ask this question. Can is the redevelopment agency going to make the final decision? Can we in fact say no unless we're happy with this design?
Oh, they have a vested right.
That might,
Mr. Chair, members of the agency, unfortunately, the final design was approved, the building permits were signed off, and the building has been constructed, including this improvement. The discussion that I've had with Mr. Howard about this is that essentially at this point in time, we're looking at a situation where their rights are essentially vested in what they have constructed at this point. They've spent a substantial amount of money in completing the improvement in reliance upon the issuance of that permit and the plans that were stamped. And so at this point in time, what we are, our hands, I would say, completely tied in that we are having a discussion and trying to solve the problem, but in terms of altering the ultimate approval of it, I would say no.
The plans that were stamped, this design was included, this specific design?
I'd have to...
There's a screen element and the design, and that's what we're working on, is the screen element. I think that's where we have some flexibility, and we would like to, we'll go back and take this input, we'll go back and we'll continue to work on a screen element that is satisfactory.
Mr. Yusefian, then Mr. Starboard. Then I have a card from the public.
If you look at this design, the public can see this design.
Get in.
The helipad was actually an embellishment, a design feature of the building. It was supposed to enhance the building. If you look at it, it almost looks like a little hat on top of the building. It was supposed to be a part of it. That was the beauty of it, because it was kind of extending out. Now, when the building was being engineered from day one, they should have figured out what it's going to take to create that if it's a poured-in-place concrete. So I think there was some cost savings involved in here, or it would not fit in within the moment frame building type of a thing that you wanted to do. Nevertheless, I think the goal in here is to achieve the look. The only way I can see this achieving the look, which you see that the design is basically black, and for you not to see this is for everything to be black. Then you can't see anything. So as you drive by, you're going to see this whole thing completely black. Underneath it is all black. And that's what it shows in here, which is all black.
Well, I did that drawing
Okay?
also many years ago, and I can tell you that was a CAD model, and the only reason that is dark is because it's in shadow. It wasn't intended
So what
to be a
did you
color.
mean by it? What did you want to see?
At the time?
Yes.
At
Since
the
you did
time, it was my helistop, and, you know, I mean, when I
And what
looked at it, yeah.
what was the material going to look like?
Well, at the time, I was looking at this large concrete, this thin concrete deck, which I'm told by the structural engineers.
And
doesn't
it
have
would
to do
be
with cost.
painted?
No. No, you get,
So it would be just concrete color?
here, yep, cast in place, exposed cast in place concrete.
Okay,
Raw
so this
structure.
is your shadows basically
That's correct.
showing it.
And from the structural engineer of record, it was unachievable. I mean, I'm lucky, so much so that they said we're lucky to have a building standing in the first place with the size of the hole that I put in the middle of this thing. I mean, that's how tight the tolerance is. I mean, it's a very structurally sound building. I mean, if you even look at the exterior of this building, it's all concrete. How that became all concrete was due to the structural demands of this building. I mean,
Mr.
The
Starboard.
walls are 18 inches.
the walls are very thick.
Mr. Starboard.
I watched it being poured.
Castcrete concrete, number 6, number 11 bars. I know that's boring detail, but it's a bridge. It's a highway infrastructure. I mean, there's so much steel in this building. It may not be the largest building, but it has more steel in it than some of the taller buildings
So
around
what
it.
could you do to make this look better than this?
You know, I mean, with the process that we went to get here, I mean, as it stands, I think that we've taken steps to mitigate the initial concern, and that was the vertical structure. There was a screening element that was left off, and we've gone through and incorporated that vertical screening to cover the vertical structure and make it look like it ties into the building. Now, from what I'm told and what I understand from my structural engineers, anything that I start placing on that, which is a life safety net for people, they don't even want us really touching that. Structural, I mean, I'd have to go back to my structural engineer and say, is there an exception?
Well, let me ask you this. Could that life safety net had it been designed in such fashion, because you have some support elements that is going out, and then you have the life safety element that is going in, and then you have those little bars that are connecting that little mesh together. Couldn't have been designed in such fashion that they kind of all read in the same place? See what I'm saying?
Unfortunately, I know exactly what you're talking about, equal spacing.
Yeah, just painted a light blue or something, it'll blend in with the sky, and you won't see the safety net.
You have these that are both but then you have this
can't hear you,
element
Mr.
down
Giuseppe,
here,
but
and this element down here.
I don't hear anyone
Couldn't have
objecting.
these elements being here and here, so you didn't have to see. That's what I'm trying.
Yeah. I guess, after the fact, there's a lot of things that probably could have been done.
Can it be taken off and moved over and added on some more? You're just talking about mesh that has been stretched. And a whole bunch of hooks.
At this point,
I know there's more work.
It's just the feasibility. I had a tower crane. When this element went up, I had a tower crane to bring the structure up to this level. I no
I'm
longer
not
have that
asking
tower
you to
crane.
modify the structure. All I'm saying is those pieces that have gone in afterwards.
And that screen went in while I had my tower crane. This stuff was lifted from a semi-truck, brought up with a tower crane that sat on the side of our building for almost 2 years, and was moved into place while they were standing up, and while there was a half a dozen men standing on top of that structure placing that. It wasn't just some guys standing on a ladder. It took the tower crane to build this structure in its entirety. Now the screening, the screen itself was a frame that was designed, and that was brought out as an element. And they placed it with the mesh in, and there was this, you see the steel structure that surrounds it? Those tubes were all listed in as one element. Not around the whole perimeter, but in sections. And then they were anchored to the structure.
Jim, do you have a comment?
Well, just that my guess is in the architect's renderings, what appears to be chain link fence, which is the netting, and it's essentially a high-grade chain link fence around the inside, that doesn't even appear. That's just considering by the architects to be something that is so lightweight that it isn't even figured as part of the structure. So what you see in the architect's rendering is the platform.
Yeah.
I was going to echo what Phil said, and that is obviously you don't like this, it isn't working, we need to go back and have design people work with the architect and see what else we can possibly do
Painting
within the constraints that he's expressing there.
black shells like crazy.
Mr. Quintero, then I have a card from the public.
Let me just say that, we're not just arbitrarily, we're kind of making this up. There's towers being built all over Southern California, all kinds of buildings going up. I have yet to see something as atrocious as this. So, yes, you had an atrium design, but I assume it's a qualified architectural firm and qualified engineers and so forth. So in the initial go-through, those things must have been thought out or should have been thought out. And so now to be saddled with this for years and years to come, man, I don't feel at all obligated to try to do some sort of cosmetic change and approve this. I don't feel obligated at all, because I don't feel that this is what we approved, period. So that's the way I see it.
Let's hear from Mr. Milano, who submitted a card on this item. 3 minutes.
Good afternoon. My name is Herbert Milano, Chair Najarian and members of the Redevelopment Agency. It's actually a pleasure to find that the aesthetic view of all of you and the concern that you have for the look. When I first saw the building, my expressions were very similar to the ones you've expressed. I said, how could the city ever approve something like this? And it gives me a greater sense of appreciation for the work that all of you have done in the past years in approving the type of designs that have made downtown Glendale such an aesthetically pleasing city. But I want to know if my recollection is correct. This particular building did receive a substantial subsidy from the redevelopment agency? No, it didn't? Oh.
No.
So, Mr. Weaver made a particular point concerning that it's only one side of this particular mesh that is protruding onto Central. I'm not an engineer, but I just wanted to toss this up just in case it might have some value to it. Since this particular structure doesn't seem to be a structure to firmly support heavy weights continually, I wondered if it could be retractable in one way or another, that then when the helicopters come in, the structure expands. Anyway, that was just a thought. Yeah. And the other concern about the mesh is whether or not the subjects, with regard to the fire department needs, need to be permanent, or they could be, for example, could have a release mechanism, so that in case of fire, they just simply release and you have the access. Anyway, those were just a couple of thoughts.
Okay, thank you. I think it's clear that the direction from the agency at this point is to send the architect back to work with our staff and perhaps include fire in that to see if there are other alternatives, other options to screen that undercarriage of the helipad, and then report back to us how soon can we do that, Mr. Lanzafame, Mr. Starber. 2 weeks, 3 weeks?
2 weeks, 3 weeks.
3 weeks.
We'll start working on it right away. We'll be back 2 to 3 weeks.
Okay.
And please check with the fire department. I'd like to hear their rationale.
We will.
And be creative, I guess. That's what we're saying, and aesthetically sensitive. Mr. Quintero.
And I would like to have the Director of Redevelopment tell us exactly how this took place and why it took place and how it could have taken place, because to blame it on one specific person who's no longer employed by the city, I just don't find that appropriate. So I'd like to know what the...
How did we get here?
Mr. Quintero, that was
we don't
not
have to
my
talk
intent.
about it now. Just write it up and let us read about it.
Mr. Drake.
On that note, Mr. Chair and Mr. Lanzafame, by the way, I was not implying that I was not interested in hearing how we got here, just simply that I didn't think we'd be benefited by that this afternoon. But I am also interested in knowing how we got here, specifically because I was not a part of that. I would like to know for future. I'm looking at this as a good lesson, practical lesson as to what to watch for in the future. However, it seems to have happened with 4 sets of eyes anyway. So, but in any case, I would like to know. So, just not.
Mr. Attorney?
Okay, Mr. Weaver.
Just want to repeat again. When we approve at the design stage and we like what we see, then it goes through the process of the engineering, the structural design, and the permitting and meeting code. Things on buildings are changing, and we're looking at them after the fact and say, that's not what we approved. Yep, it sure isn't, because when we translated into code requirements and structural design, couldn't do it. And there's no mechanism for it at that stage to be coming back and having the building official and the other standing here telling us, well, that's impossible. An architect can do one thing, but when it translates what our codes say, it can be tweaked and not look the same. That's just the reality of. This is not the first. There's been others. I've seen the same thing happen.
Okay, well, I'd like to move on. Mr. Yusefian.
Mr. Weaver is absolutely correct. I think that's what happens. But I think in significant buildings, especially signature buildings, which this is one of them, I think there needs to be a mechanism, maybe some direction that says to staff from now on, when you see this type of modifications before they're approved over the counter, it needs to come back to the agency, because I know when they change designs in regular residential and there's a modification, it doesn't look like design review, staff sends it back to design review. And in this case, we were the design review. And
yep.
So,
and we answered to the public.
Okay, thank you. This was a report-only item. let's move to the next item, please.
At 6B is Director of Development Services regarding professional services agreements for financial advisory services and bond counsel services for the Central Glendale Redevelopment Project area. At B1 is a motion approving and accepting the proposal from Harrell and Company to provide financial advisory services in an amount not to exceed $75,000. At B2 is a motion approving and accepting the proposal from Jones Hall to provide bond counsel services in an amount not to exceed $63,000.
Thank you. I have a request to speak on this item. Mr. Milano.
Good evening, members of the redevelopment agent. Good afternoon. My name is Herbert Milano. From my access of the information that appears on the agenda item, I don't recall really receiving a link to any more information other than what appears here on the agenda. And my first concern was the city's or the redevelopment agency's approach towards obtaining additional bonds and additional indebtedness with regard to redevelopment. If I understand correctly, the obtaining additional obligations will then ensure the extension of the redevelopment agency's purpose for a few more years. I don't know if that's part of the rationale for it, but I think that the public should have at least a summary of the potential additional indebtedness overall for redevelopment and for the city as a whole, so that we can gauge the obligations of the city, especially in times of an economic crisis that we have nationally. We have a very significant indebtedness already, so does the county, so does the state of California, so does the national government. And I think it will be good for the public to have maybe some extra transparency so we can always gauge an agency or the city's additional indebtedness as it goes forward with its projects. Thank you.
Okay. And I think that's exactly what the retention of these firms are going to do, to analyze the feasibility of issuing the bonds. Mr. Starver.
I was going to say that very same thing. In addition to that, as we're finding out this year, the other advantage to utilizing bonds to secure your tax increment, in addition to the fact that you have to have debt in order to receive tax increment, is it is a way of preventing the state from taking your resources every time they have a budget deficit. Like they're doing this year, $350 million of tax increment money is being taken from local agencies, including Glendale, to be used to, for a one-time purpose, plug the hole in the state. Next year they will still have a major deficit and likely be back again taking money from redevelopment agencies. They can't do that once you've bonded it. But you're right, Mr. Najarian. These are two critical members of the bond team that will be necessary to provide the information that Mr. Milano's requested.
And when they do issue an opinion, they'll be coming before us.
Well, you'll have all those numbers back before you, long before you can actually approve bonds.
Mr. Quintero, then Mr. Weaver.
An RFP was issued, and I see we had a number of firms that responded. Who was on the committee that picked the two firms?
We had representatives from Development Services, Finance, and the Housing Authority, staff members, looking at all of the responses.
Mr. Weaver.
I'd like to move 6B1 and 2.
Is there a second?
Second.
Is there any other discussion? Mr. Youssef.
I'm going to vote for this, but that doesn't mean I'm going to vote for the bonds. I'm just going to vote for the information.
I think that goes without saying that we're a long way from voting for any bonds at this point. This is just to hear what the attorneys have to recommend.
And I might add on that note, Mr. Chair, even if we had a good market, you'd be a ways away yet from actually approving bonds. But in this market, you probably won't see anything substantive until after the first of the calendar year.
Okay, very good. We all reserve our rights to vote on that when it comes up. Motion and a second. Roll call, please.
Agency members Draymond,
Yes.
Quintero,
Yes.
Weaver,
Aye.
Yusefian,
Aye.
Chairman Najarian.
Yes. Any comments from members or staff? No?
Move we adjourn.
Second.
We are adjourned.